So our second big concept this week is multimodality. I said in the intro video for the course that probably seems like a very highfalutin kind of concept that's going to be very complex to learn. It's not. I mentioned that via your generational position, you all are adept multimodal communicators already, whether that's, has to do with what you read and encounter in terms of content online, or, content that you create yourselves on your own social media accounts. We are constantly encountering and creating multimodal communications in kind of just our day-to-day life, from your Twitter account to maybe a meme chat that you share with your friends. So what does it mean then for a text to be multimodal? It simply means that it's using multiple modes of sensory appeal. So those modes, we identify 5 of them: linguistic, visual, aural, spatial, and gestural. The linguistic is obvious. That's, how is the text making use of language, whether that's written language or spoken language. The visual also, I think, is another obvious one. How is the text making use of visuals? Is there a video component? Are there pictures, graphs, charts that help us to understand concepts and information? From there, we have aural, which is sound. What is the role of sound in our understanding of the text? So when we're talking about texts that have like this, a video component, there's an aural component to it, but we could also be talking about music as well. When you watch a film, the music and the way the music functions is highly persuasive in terms of the emotions that you feel during certain scenes. So aural appeals can be very important in a number of different genres. From there, we have gestural, which is, body language, movement, and spatial, which is like how the different elements of the text are positioned in relation to one another. Normally in class, what we would do is take a look at a number of different examples and discuss those examples. And we're still going to do that via the slideshow assignment that's included on this week's to-do. But I want to also go through some examples quickly with you too. So you can look up these books. You can probably find them in the library at Northeastern, not the actual books, I know that, but the digital copies of them. But I have a number of books from my personal collection that just happen to be, multimodal. So I'm going to talk about each one quickly and what each one tries to do. I'm going to focus on how each one marries form and content, because that's really what we're trying to do when we make a multimodal appeal. Is find some way to make the structure of the content of the text that we're creating mirror the structure of the ideas that we want to try to get across. The first example we're going to take a look at comes from a genre you all should be very familiar with by this point in your educational career, which are textbooks. This is They Say, I Say. It is a rhetoric and composition text that many of my peers use. I do not use it. The way that it advertises itself is essentially as a rhetoric and composition text that's student-centric. It's more exciting than other rhetoric and composition texts, and that doesn't feel like reading a textbook. And the way that they accomplish that through multimodality in the piece is by including, things like these hand-drawn cartoons into the piece. Or using other visual elements like certain font choices and the kind of the arrangement of the text to make the appeal that this isn't necessarily, your grandfather's rhetoric and composition text, I guess. There's images throughout and things like that. So this is one thing we do with multimodal text, right? We try to take genres that maybe aren't necessarily as engaging and make them more engaging by making them multimodal. So the idea is to make this book feel like kind of what you would be doing in a classroom, which is a little more dynamic than just sort of reading text. You might be looking at images. You might be using those comics as a jumping off point for discussion or something like that. So that's one way we can do multimodal communication. Next up, we have a novel. I actually mentioned this in the Ask Me Anything. This is House of Leaves by Mark Danielewski. And what I would say about this novel is that it's unlike anything else that I've ever read. And I could just open up, like a couple of pages and show you why here. So there are whole sections of the book where, the text kind of spaces out, sometimes just one or a couple words per page. There's other places where the text becomes very sort of like claustrophobic and disorienting. And if you look closely, you can see that in some of those boxes, the orientation of the text changes so that when you're reading the book, you actually have to like turn the book physically like this in order to read it. So there's a heavy amount of, I would say, spatial and visual organization going on in this book, and that has to do with what the book is about. So the book is essentially, or what you get is a mimetic narrative written by a person who themselves has found a manuscript in their apartment that belongs to somebody else, they don't know who, and this manuscript describes a documentary film that nobody else has ever seen that's about this house that features a physical anomaly whereby the interior of the house is just ever so slightly bigger than the exterior of the house. And this leads the protagonist of the novel to find kind of this like void-like maze inside of the house. And that's what you get the story of. You get the story of the person watching the documentary about the people trying to document the existence of this maze. And the whole thing feels like being lost in some kind of a maze or labyrinth. And so that's what the book is like. That's how the book is designed. It's designed to be disorienting and labyrinthine and to make you kind of question reality as you read through. So again, that marriage of form and content. We want to try to make textbooks exciting. Sure, that's one thing we can do with multimodality. We want to make our readers feel the way that the characters in our stories feel when they're very disoriented. That's another way we can use it. Next, we're going to look at a book called Storyteller by Leslie Marmon Silko. Leslie Marmon Silko is a Native American author. She's part of the Laguna Pueblo tribe. And what she tried to do with this storyteller book was to try to communicate to non-Native audiences the role that storytelling plays, the oral tradition plays in Native American culture. So in this book, you get a real mix of things here. You get some poetry, obvious, and some of that poetry is kind of like concrete poetry, where some of the form, the physical form of the poetry is supposed to be similar to the subject matter of the poetry. You also get many of Leslie's own photographs here as well. So that's a photograph of her grandmother. Her grandmother is the storyteller referred to in the title, the person she heard most of the stories about her tribe and her tribe's origin from growing up. Here you have more photographs as well. A lot of them are of the American Southwestern landscape, because that is key to much Native American culture, is the relationship between the tribe and the land. So Leslie Marmon Silko here compiles fiction, nonfiction, poetry, photography, and some other genres as well, in order to communicate something about her tribal experience to people who haven't lived that tribal experience. So that's another thing we can do with multimodality. Sometimes entire genres rely on multimodality in order to just do what it is that they do as a genre. So here I've got The Watchmen, which is a graphic novel. The Watchmen is about basically the concept of, like, you know, the saying is, who watches the Watchmen? There's this group of superheroes who have been altering history over the course of time for decades and decades, and it kind of The Watchmen explores the ethical implications of allowing something like a superhero to exist and letting them do what it is that they do. So obviously here, lots of visual to talk about. There's certain colors that correspond with certain characters, and certain kind of color designs that correspond with certain different kinds of action. But also in a graphic novel, the spatial design of the pages and the panels is huge. It's how you understand the story. It's how you understand the chronological movement of the story. And beyond that, there's a lot of multimodality used for world building in this piece as well. So it features some of these things, like this is, you know, a fictionalized dossier on, you know, one of the characters from a time when they were institutionalized for, you know, mental health issues. So there's a lot to this particular example of a graphic novel, but there's a lot to the genre in general as well in terms of multimodality, because we're even getting into, when a comic book character punches another comic book character and you have that thing that pops up. It's just like pow or bang, Is that an aural appeal? I don't know. It might be. If you hear it in your head, is it an aural appeal? It could be. Comic books, too, have a lot of characters speaking in their own voice. So when you hear them in your head speaking in their own voice, is that an element of multimodality, too? I think these are interesting questions to think about. But it's also interesting to think about how storytelling over time has kind of adapted in form to be more visual and to have more of a visual component. And to look at how different authors take advantage of that. So the basic idea is that these texts try to get us to, I think, have a different reading experience by making appeals to senses other than just the linguistic. So when we look at, for instance, the They Say, I Say textbook, they're trying to give you the feeling that you're in an engaging and dynamic classroom, even though you're just reading the book. If we were to talk about the Mark Danielewski book, again, trying to give you the experience of the characters through the construction of the text itself. The Leslie Marmon Silko book, it's looking to articulate something about the oral tradition, to give the reader the experience of storytelling in the oral tradition through a traditional print book text. And then with The Watchmen, really the storytelling is the multimodal element. The storytelling happens through the visuals. And so without that visual component, I think we would be really lost to understand what was going on there. However, there's a number of other ways that you can use it too. And I really think the main thing that makes all of these very successful multimodal texts is that marriage between form and composition. So form and content. Here we have Beat Culture in the New America, which is a reader on beat culture. It was published by the Whitney Museum. And this is maybe the best example, because when you flip through this book, it really does feel like you're just kind of looking at a museum exhibit about beat culture and about beat art, where there's not very much in the way of text, but there's a lot of images. Much of those images are of, different art pieces created by artists of the beat generation and the beat movement. This one, published by a museum, is meant to feel like moving through a museum. I also have this collection of photographs by Allen Ginsberg, which is another beat movement artifact. And this one, again, is kind of meant to feel like you're just sort of flipping through the personal photographs of Allen Ginsberg, like you're just flipping through his photo album. They even have his handwritten annotations on the photographs too, so that you can see what it is that Ginsberg himself wrote on the photographs after he took them. So these are multimodal texts. This is how we use them. We essentially look at situations where we want to communicate something that has to be communicated beyond words. And we figure out how to use a range of different appeals, whether they be linguistic, visual, aural, spatial, or gestural, in order to accomplish that. So that's multimodality. If you've ever made a YouTube video, if you've ever made an Instagram story, if you've ever, posted a meme on Reddit or something like that, then you're savvy at creating multimodal text in one way or another. Certainly we're savvy at consuming them. We consume multimodality constantly. Pretty much all of our media is somewhat multimodal at this point. More so, as I mentioned before, you can kind of get into the concept and break it down further. Sometimes those divisions in mode are very kind of obvious, but other times they might not be. So, for instance, is spoken dialogue in a novel multimodal? Is that an aural appeal? Do you hear the dialogue in your head when you read it? I don't know. It's an interesting question. I tend to think that it is, and I tend to qualify that most texts are multimodal in one way or another when we really think about them and the experience that we have with them as an audience. But at the very least, we're going to be making many multimodal texts throughout the course of this class. Many of the projects that you're going to do are going to be required to be multimodal in one way or another. But I think it's a good concept to learn, because we should always be thinking about how multimodality can help us to become more engaging writers, more engaging communicators.